Changing classroom curriculum. The Texas Board of Education decides tomorrow what your kids will and will not learn in school.
The textbook changes could remove historical figures and events from statewide curriculum.
Eyewitness News reporter Roxy Bustamante takes a look at the controversy. And Roxy, why has this become so contentious?
The lessons that are approved by the board could influence what is published in textbooks here in Texas and potentially other states. The goal is to eliminate topics to help teachers who say there's too much material to cover. But some argue doing this removes key figures from history.
We should not delete this history.
Teachers, activists, and experts fought to stop the Texas Board of Education from editing out key historical figures.
Within this last year, they've gone through what was called a streamlining process for what the teachers were going to be teaching in social studies from pre-K to 12th grade.
The board voted to restore the lessons on Hillary Clinton, Helen Keller, and women Air Force service pilots, and maintain the lessons on the Civil War and the biblical figure Moses' influence on our founding fathers.
We made recommendations to the State Board of Education that there's just this lack of representation, which was our biggie, right? And that, in fact, more women needed to be included. And really, in a lot of ways, we were primarily ignored.
Juan Tejeda, a retired professor from Palo Alto College, was part of the successful fight to get Mexican-American studies offered as an elective course in high schools effective next year.
That was a very important victory. First time that any Mexican-American studies or ethnic studies course is approved by the State Board of Education.
He believes while restoring the lessons about female political figures was a step in the right direction, he says much more needs to be done.
At the board, the elected board, our representatives, and the majority is more satisfied with just keeping the status quo.
Could still be more changes made before the final vote, which is scheduled for tomorrow. Roxy Bustamante, KENS 5 Eyewitness News.